Hello, my name is Peter Raymer, and today we're going to look at batch jobs in Microsoft Dynamics 365 for finance and operations. Do you have a process that you need to run in the background? Batch jobs are what you need. There's a couple different ways of creating batch jobs. You can create one using SysOperation Framework, and I've got another video and article that covers this. Then there's kind of the original way, which is to create a class that extends RunBaseBatch. Both are batch jobs. They have different, maybe pros and cons, and I won't get into the debate of which one you should use. But in this article, we're going to cover the RunBaseBatch batch jobs. Okay. First of all, let's cover from a high level of what is a batch job, why should you use it, how do you function with them, and then we're going to get into the X++ code of how do we actually write a batch job. So a batch job is a process, some code that you want to run in the background. Maybe it takes a while to run, and so offloading it to the server to run is a really good idea. Maybe you need to run it out of schedule, like once a day in the evening. Maybe you just need to run it once every 15 minutes or 2 hours. There's a lot you can do with batch jobs. And having that process run behind the scenes. So that's really the purpose of a batch job. Anything that you need to maybe loop through is a good idea for a batch job. So here's one example real quick. This is the process automatic notification cancellation events. Essentially, batch jobs are run by just clicking on a menu item in the system. In this case, I've searched for process automatic, and I can click on it. And then inherent to a batch job, I get this dialog box. The dialog box may have parameters or it may not. We'll look at that a little later. And then it's going to have this run in background fast tab. From here, I can either click OK to run the process immediately and wait on the process, and my user will be held up until the process finishes. Or the real power of the batch job is when I click this checkbox, I say batch processing is yes, and then that process will get saved and run by the server in the background. This is really, really useful even if you've got a process that maybe only takes a minute. If the user is not actually needing to wait on the output, see what the output is, but they just know they need to run it, creating a process as a batch job's going to create a better user experience because they can continue to work, continue to direct the system in what they need to do instead of waiting on a task to finish. On this form, this whole run in background fast tab are things that we get for free by extending RunBaseBatch. So this is really fantastic. You'll see these on any batch job. This is really what kind of defines a batch job in our case when you're looking at it from the front end. There's a couple other things I'll point out real quick. You can set up alerts as well as a recurrence. A recurrence gives you another additional form that you don't have to program by hand. You get this for free as using this framework. But essentially you can schedule how often you want this batch job to run and for how long. So you might say, okay, I want to run this batch job once every day, and I would like to start it at a particular time. Maybe you want to run it in the middle of the night, and then you could say no end date, keep running forever, or you can say no, I have a particular end date in mind. So all of this is really fantastic, and it's great that as a developer you don't have to program this into your batch job every single time you write a batch job. All right, so after you click OK, where does the batch job go? So let me show you that real quick. If I go over to this other tab, essentially if you search for batch jobs in your system, you'll see under System Administration Inquiries Batch Jobs, you have this form. This form allows you to see any batch jobs that you set up and are in the system. They might be, you'll see that the task that has been entered here, this task description, will become the job description here. So that's really useful. You can then filter the job description to find the batch job that you're looking to run. I won't cover this in detail, this form, but this will show you when the batch job's gonna run. You can look at the batch job history by clicking on this button and seeing any instances of in the past when this batch job's run. You can also change the status of this batch job to be canceled or withhold in case you need the batch job to not run and process your data for a particular amount of time. You can also set up alerts on this batch job in case maybe the batch job has thrown an error. You can also view the different parameters passed to a batch job from within this form too. Okay, awesome. So this is the real high-level look of how we functionally use a batch job. You can even create complex batch jobs with some sub-batch jobs or tasks within them. Let's switch back to how do we create a batch job through code. So we can come in here, and I'm going to come into Visual Studio. We can create a new project. I've done that already. And I can right-click on my project, select Add New Item, and then I can pick a class, and then I can name something, my batch job 2 batch. It's kind of a loose best practice to end the name of your batch job with batch. I've also seen the word cleanup at the end, but that's pretty common to use the word batch as a suffix in your name. So all this is going to do is create a class. But in this case, a batch job can be created simply by typing the word extends RunBaseBatch. That's it. So obviously this won't actually do anything, but this is the core of what it means to have a batch job. The RunBaseBatch class contains a lot of code to do the recurrence for us, the run in background, a fast tab, the dialog, all those pieces are kind of handled for us. We just need to implement certain methods to tell the batch job, okay, what am I actually doing and what parameters do I need to take in. So this is one way to create a batch job. I can do this by from scratch, but then I would really have to remember all of the different methods that I need to implement. So what I like to do is, I call it cheating, though it's not cheating, it's just a good idea, is to look at an example, and you can either copy those values from an example, or better yet, we can duplicate that existing batch job. So I've got an example over here, MCR FTC event process batch. If I type that into the Application Explorer, it's going to return some results. I'm looking for the class in this result. So I'll go ahead and open this up and say Open Designer at the moment, just so we can see the methods in it. I've been duplicating this class since before it was part of base product. You can also find many other batch classes just by simply searching for the word batch and then looking for classes that end in the word batch. That's not, a surefire way of seeing if it's a batch class, but it's a great way to find others if you just want to look at other examples. So before I get into the methods of this, let's go ahead and duplicate this class so we can use it for our purposes. I can right-click on this class and then say duplicate in project. What that's going to do is it's going to create a duplicate of this class and add the word copy at the end. So before I open this, I'm going to right click on this and I'm going to say rename, and I'm going to name it for my own purposes. So I'm going to say my batch job, in this case I'll call it 3 since I already have some other batch jobs here, and then finish it with the name batch. So okay, now I can right click and say open or open designer. I'll go ahead and open the designer as well on this just so we get to see the methods. Every batch job really has some core methods that we have to have. We need a main method, a run method, a pack method, an unpack method, and a description. And then if we have parameters on our batch job, we really need a dialog and a from Dialog. There's some additional methods that are optional that can control your batch job in further ways. But let's go ahead and wade in and look at the code, and we can kind of explain each method one by one. Again, I recommend if you duplicate an existing batch job, you can go in this code and then just change it for your purposes, and that's usually the easiest way I've found to create a batch job. All right, so the first thing I want to start with is the main method. After we create a batch job class, we also need a menu item that calls this class. And any menu item, you can see this one here, MCR, FTC, event, process, batch. This is an action menu. This menu item, when it's called, it is going to call the main method on the class that it's pointing to. I'll show you that real quick with the properties. The properties have an object type of class, and an object is the name of the class. Whenever you do this, the system's naturally going to call the main method on the class. So if we go back over here, we can look at the main method. The main method really needs to do a few things every single time. So again, these are going to look very similar, and this is very easy to change for your batch job as well. First, this is a static method, so you need to instantiate your batch job. So in my case, I would change this to be my batch job 3 batch, and then I would give it a variable name and say new my batch job 3 batch. And then this parmin batch, this is optional, but this will tell the system whether by default that run in background flag that we see here, or sorry, this batch processing flag is set to yes or no. Again, you don't need this, but you can set it to false by default. The next two lines we need an if statement that says call the prompt method. The prompt method is going to open up the dialog and cause it to show our values. So again, that's this dialog form right here. The great news is, yeah, we don't have to do any code for that if we don't have any parameters. The system will handle creating that for us, but we do need to call it. So we're going to say if prompt. And then essentially, if the user has clicked OK on that dialog, we want to call run operation on the base class, which is that RunBaseBatch class. And then that's going to call the run method. So I get that that was maybe a little complicated, but again, pretty much every batch job you're going to see that uses RunBaseBatch, it'll follow this format, and you just replace the name of your class and the name of your variable. The next method we're going to look at is the run method, and this is the one that's really important. This is where you're going to put your code that needs to do whatever it needs to do to process records, whether that's clean up data, maybe you've got records in a staging table and you need to process them, create sales orders. In this case, this is sending out event notifications. The key thing to remember is that in most batch jobs, you are going to have either a while loop that loops through the code. In this case, I have a while select loop that's going to loop through some records and send out these notifications. Or you may have a query object that you've built within the application Explorer, and you are looping through the records using that query object. That's not a hard requirement, but that just makes sense that usually batch jobs, we have many records that we're looping through and processing. But now I want to take a quick moment to kind of explain the idea behind batch jobs and some common patterns. So it doesn't help us if we run a batch job that looks at the exact same records and processes the exact same records every time we run it. That won't save time. We're losing time, and then as records grow in the system, your batch job's going to take longer and longer. We need our batch job to take an action that basically moves records from a place of needing to be processed to process and such that they won't get picked up by this while loop the next time. So in the case of this batch job, we actually have a from and a start date and end date as parameters, but just using those by themselves wouldn't be helpful because we'd then be processing the same start and end date every recurrence. And if we're running that nightly, we're still processing the same range of records. So there's a few ways we can essentially write this query to process records that change over time. One way we can do that is we can look at a status. We can have, say, a status of to be processed on the record. And then we're going to look for all records that need to be processed. And then in the middle of our while loop, we change that status to be either completed or potentially error. But that moves those records out of the status of to be processed, and it makes it so if we run this batch job each day, it's going to be looking at new records and not always process the same. Another pattern is we use date time to change the records we're looking at. Perhaps we store a value of the last time we've run this batch job in a table. And so maybe that was 1 week ago. And then we write this query such that it will process all records with a created date time that is older than that date that we've stored. So, or I'm sorry, more recent than the date we've stored. So if last time we ran this was a week ago, process any records with a created date time more recent. And then at the end, once we finish processing our records, we're going to update our table with that new date time value. And so that way, if you run it this batch job every 15 minutes or once an hour or once a day or once a week, it doesn't matter. It's always going to process the records it needs to process and no more. A last common model is to use the current date time and some kind of parameter to understand what records to pick up in the past. So you may have a data cleanup job where you say, I want to delete all records that are older than 30 days. And so what you can do is you can take the current date time using like a date function, like get system date time, to get the current date. And then you can add a parameter or that's either passed in or stored on a table that says, okay, anything that's older than 30 days from right now, go ahead and delete. And that way, as that batch job runs each day or weekly or however often you run it, the records that you are going to process change. So this is a really important concept of how you write your code in here. So that's why I wanted to take a minute to cover it. In the end, the run method does not have any rules. You're going to loop through these records and return out. All right, let's look at some of the other methods that are just important for us to understand with batch jobs. The next one I'm going to look at is the dialog method. This dialog method allows us to have parameters on our form. So in this case, I'm creating this dialog run based control, and I get that this is maybe a little bit technical, but I think you'll be okay. We can set the caption that shows on our dialog. And in this case, I'm adding two fields. One that's of type trans date that it has a label of start date, and one that has another extended data type of trans date with a label of end date. And I'm setting the initial default values to blank. And then I return this dialog control. And then what that does for me, we'll look at this, is it gives me these two parameters. So maybe you've got an integer, maybe you've got a string, maybe you've got a date that you need to pass to this process. That's how you do it, is you use this dialog method, and this essentially overrides the dialog method in the base class. or in this case extends it, and you can run this code too to add these additional fields. Again, this method is optional. If you do not have parameters in your batch job, you don't need this method. Okay. Likewise, once we have a dialog method, we also need a GetFromDialog method. This GetFromDialog method will grab the values out of the dialog controls that we've created and store them in a class variable, and it can run additional logic as so if a user hasn't specified the date, we can still set it to a minimum date or maximum date. So now that we have these dialogues setting the variables, we actually need variables declared to store these values. So if I scroll up to the very top, this is where I can see we've declared 2 dialog field controls and 2 variables for storing these values. This is going to become important in just a little bit here. So next, we can look at 3 other places. There's pack and unpack, and this gets a little bit harder to explain, but luckily it's really easy to write and easy to copy and paste. So what we can do here is look at this section. This is called a macro. So essentially what this does is it tells the compiler, actually, anytime it sees a pound current version, to replace it with the value 2. That's all you need to know at the moment. And anytime it sees a pound current list in this class, to replace it with essentially this text right here that's going to list our variables. So this will make more sense in a second, but let's look at the pack method. So what this does is when I click OK on the dialog form and say I want to run this in batch, it needs to store any variables I've entered on this form for later use. Well, instead of creating like a table with specific fields for every parameter, needing to change that, luckily it gets a lot simpler. It just looks more complex from a technical standpoint. What the system's going to do is it's going to take any parameters or variables you have, and it's going to pack them into a container and store that container in the batch table in the parameters field. So this is really great. It allows us to be generic, whether we have 2 parameters or 20 parameters, they all get stored the same way. So all you have to do is copy and paste this pack and leave it the same. The current list will get replaced by that number, in our case 2, or sorry, the current version will, and the current list will get the list of all of our parameters and store them off. So the important thing to remember is just that you specify in this current list any parameters that you need to make use of within the run method. So the pack is going to get called by the system when you click OK, and it builds this container that is stored in a table so that each recurrence it can reuse these values. The unpack is essentially the opposite and works for us. So the unpack, again, looks a little bit more complicated, but really what this is doing is the system is going to, every time it tries to run the batch job from a recurrence, it's going to pass the container that was stored in its table to this method, and then this line of code essentially reassigns the variables that you have stored. So it resets, in this case, the start date and the end date. If you had other parameters, it would do that as well, and that makes it so they're set correctly for when you need to use them within the run method. In the run method, we're then using those start and end date parameters right here. In the end, I realize that's a little complicated. The good news is that the pack and unpack basically never need to change. You just make sure that they're in your code and that you've set the current list, and then you're good to go. Okay. So that's the main thing. There's one last method I wanted to explain. There's the description method. This description method has a label. This can return the description that you see on your batch job dialog here. So that's really useful, and you want to make sure you set that. There's some additional methods as well that I won't cover in this video. Some show query values, is retriable, can run a new session, validate. So there's a few more that you can check out and read the article on, but those are all optional. So kind of in conclusion, this is RunBaseBatch. Batch jobs, they're really useful for running background processes and making the customer experience that much easier. Really the easiest way to create them is to duplicate and follow an example and then just modify it for your purposes. And the main method is the run method that contains your code. The rest of these methods are often just some find and replace and some tweaking of an example. Okay, I hope you've learned something new today. Thanks. I really appreciate you watching. If you liked the video, click the like button. I also invite you to push the subscribe button as well. If there's other topics you would like to see a video on, please post in the comments and I'll see what I can do. I hope you learned something new today. Thank you.